The knife went through my heart at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and the last thing I saw was my husband's face watching from the shadows as his mistress twisted the blade deeper into my chest. I remember thinking how fitting it was that rain was falling against the warehouse windows, creating twisted shadows that danced across the concrete floor where my blood was pooling. Then everything went black, and I thought that was the end of my pathetic story. But death, it turns out, had other plans for me. I woke up gasping, clutching my chest where the knife had been, only to find smooth, unmarked skin beneath my trembling fingers. The familiar scent of jasmine perfume filled my nostrils, and I recognized it immediately. It was the perfume I'd worn on my wedding day, 7 years ago. My eyes shot open, and I was staring at a ceiling I hadn't seen in years. The pale pink walls, the vintage vanity with its ornate mirror, the delicate lace curtains that filtered the morning sunlight into soft, golden streams. This was my old bedroom in my family's mansion, the room I'd lived in before I married him, before I destroyed my life chasing after a man who never loved me. My hands were shaking as I reached for the antique hand mirror on the nightstand, and when I saw my reflection, I nearly dropped it. The face staring back at me was younger, softer, unmarked by the years of heartbreak and humiliation that had aged me beyond my years. My skin was luminous, my eyes bright and hopeful instead of hollow and defeated. This was me at 23, fresh out of university, still believing in fairy tales and happy endings. Still believing that Kazuki Nakamura would one day look at me the way he looked at her. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had somehow returned to 7 years ago, to the exact moment when everything began to go wrong. It was the morning of the charity gala where I would first meet Yuki Tanaka, the woman who would become my husband's mistress, the woman who would orchestrate my downfall, the woman who would ultimately murder me in that cold warehouse while the man I loved watched in silence. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, my mind racing through the memories that felt both distant and immediate. In my previous life, I had been so eager to prove myself worthy of Kazuki's love that I had ignored every red flag, every warning sign, every moment when his coldness should have told me the truth. I remembered how I had begged him to notice me, how I had reshaped myself into what I thought he wanted, how I had given up my dreams, my friends, my very identity in pursuit of his affection. But this time would be different. This time, I knew the truth. I knew that behind his handsome facade and charming smile, Kazuki was a man capable of watching his wife die without lifting a finger to help her. I knew that Yuki, with her sweet voice and innocent appearance, was a master manipulator who had planned my destruction from the moment we met. I knew that the love I had wasted 7 years of my life pursuing was nothing but an illusion, a cruel joke that had cost me everything. The morning light streaming through my windows felt different now, not warm and promising but stark and revealing. I could see the dust motes dancing in the air, and they reminded me of how I used to dance around Kazuki's moods, always trying to please him, always failing. The sound of birds chirping outside seemed almost mocking, like nature itself was laughing at the naive girl I used to be. I stood up and walked to my vanity, studying my reflection more carefully. My hair was longer than it had been when I died, cascading down my back in waves that Kazuki used to say reminded him of silk. But I remembered how he had asked me to cut it short just a year into our marriage, claiming he preferred the practical look. I had complied, of course, just as I had complied with every other request he made, slowly erasing pieces of myself until there was nothing left but a hollow shell desperate for his approval. The weight of my memories pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. I remembered our wedding day, how beautiful I had felt in my grandmother's vintage dress, how I had believed that finally, I would have the love story I had dreamed of since childhood. Kazuki had looked so handsome in his black tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile seeming to promise me the world. But even then, even on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, I had noticed how his eyes seemed to scan the crowd during our vows, as if he were looking for someone more interesting than his bride. I had told myself it was just nerves, that all grooms were nervous. I made excuses for him the way I would make excuses for him for the next 7 years, until the day I died with his indifference as the last thing I experienced. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I knew without looking who it would be. Kazuki. In my previous life, he had called me that morning to confirm our plans for the charity gala, his voice warm and attentive in a way that had made my heart soar. I had been so starved for his attention that even the smallest gesture had felt like a gift from heaven. But now I understood the truth. He had only been calling because his family expected him to escort me to the event. It was all for show, all performance, all part of the elaborate game he and Yuki would play at my expense. I let the phone ring until it went to voicemail, then listened to the message he left. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, smooth and confident with just a hint of the charm that had first captured my attention when we met at university. He was saying something about picking me up at 7, about how beautiful I would look in the dress he had chosen for me, about how he was looking forward to spending the evening with me. Every word was a lie, and now I could hear it. The slight impatience beneath his polite tone, the way he rushed through the romantic phrases as if they were items on a checklist, the complete lack of genuine warmth or affection. How had I ever believed this man loved me? How had I convinced myself that his cold politeness was simply his way of showing care? I deleted the message without calling him back and walked to my closet. The red dress he had chosen was hanging there, the same dress I had worn to the gala in my previous life. It was beautiful, I had to admit, a stunning crimson gown that hugged my curves and made my skin glow. But I remembered how uncomfortable I had felt wearing it, how the neckline had seemed too low, how the color had felt too bold for my personality. Kazuki had insisted I wear it, claiming it would photograph well for the society pages, and I had ignored my own preferences to please him. This time, I pushed the red dress aside and selected something different. An elegant black dress that I had bought but never worn, too afraid that Kazuki would disapprove of my choice. It was sophisticated without being flashy, beautiful without being desperate for attention. When I put it on, I felt like myself for the first time in years, even though technically those years hadn't happened yet. The day passed in a strange haze of déjà vu and newfound clarity. I found myself remembering conversations I had forgotten, small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but now revealed themselves as crucial pieces of a puzzle I had been too blind to solve. I remembered how Kazuki's mother had always treated me with cool politeness, how his friends had seemed amused by my obvious devotion to a man who barely acknowledged my presence, how even strangers at social events had looked at us with something that might have been pity. Everyone had known except me. Everyone had seen what I had refused to see, that I was trapped in a one-sided love affair with a man who was incapable of genuine emotion, at least where I was concerned. As evening approached, I prepared for the gala with a calmness that surprised me. In my previous life, I had spent hours getting ready, desperately trying to perfect every detail in the hope that tonight would be the night Kazuki finally looked at me with love instead of obligation. I had tried on 3 different pairs of earrings, changed my lipstick twice, and practically given myself a panic attack worrying about whether my hair looked right. This time, I dressed quickly and efficiently. I kept my makeup simple and elegant, chose jewelry that I actually liked instead of pieces I thought he would prefer, and styled my hair in a way that made me feel confident rather than constantly worried about his approval. When the doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, my heart didn't flutter the way it used to. Instead, I felt a cold sort of determination settle over me like armor. I was going to that gala, not to win his love or to play the perfect wife, but to see everything clearly for the first time. I was going to watch the performance from the outside instead of being trapped within it. Kazuki was waiting at the bottom of the stairs when I descended, and for a moment, his expression shifted into something that might have been genuine surprise. In my previous life, he had complimented the red dress with the same mechanical politeness he used for everything else. But now, seeing me in black, seeing me moving with purpose instead of desperate hope, something flickered in his eyes that I couldn't quite identify. "You look different," he said, and there was a question in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Do I?" I replied, accepting his offered arm but not clinging to it the way I used to. "Perhaps you're just seeing me clearly for the first time." The drive to the gala was uncomfortably quiet. In my previous life, I had chattered nervously, trying to fill the silence with conversation, asking him about his work, his day, his thoughts, desperate for any scrap of his attention. He had responded with polite but distant answers, and I had convinced myself that his reserve was simply his personality, that deep down he appreciated my interest in his life. This time, I said nothing. I watched the city lights blur past the window and let him sit with the silence. I could feel him glancing at me occasionally, and there was a tension in the car that hadn't been there before. He seemed almost unsettled by my composure. "Is everything all right?" he finally asked as we pulled up to the hotel where the gala was being held. "You seem different tonight." I turned to look at him then, really look at him, and for the first time I saw him as he truly was instead of as I had wanted him to be. He was still handsome, still impeccably dressed, still possessed of that smooth charm that had first attracted me. But now I could see the coldness in his dark eyes, the calculating way he assessed everything around him, the complete absence of genuine warmth when he looked at me. "I'm exactly the same," I told him. "Perhaps the question is whether you've been paying enough attention to notice." Something shifted in his expression then, a flicker of, what? Confusion? Irritation? For a moment, he looked like a man who had just realized that a game he thought he was winning had suddenly changed rules. The hotel ballroom was exactly as I remembered it, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over elegantly dressed guests, the soft sound of a string quartet playing in the background, the subtle scent of expensive perfume and fresh flowers filling the air. In my previous life, I had felt overwhelmed by the glamour of it all, anxious about fitting in among these wealthy, sophisticated people who seemed to belong in a world I was still trying to navigate. This time, I moved through the crowd with quiet confidence. I no longer cared about impressing these people or proving that I deserved to be Kazuki's wife. I knew my worth now, and it had nothing to do with his opinion of me. I was making polite conversation with the wife of a prominent businessman when I saw her. Yuki Tanaka, moving through the crowd like a predator in designer clothing. She was even more beautiful than I had remembered, delicate features, porcelain skin, long black hair that caught the light as she moved. She wore a white dress that seemed to glow under the chandeliers, and men's heads turned to follow her as she passed. But this time, I could see past the surface beauty to the calculation underneath. I watched her eyes as she scanned the room, noting how she assessed each person she encountered, how she filed away information about their wealth, their influence, their potential usefulness to her. She was hunting, and I knew that Kazuki was her target. In my previous life, I had liked her immediately. She had approached me with such apparent warmth and sincerity, complimenting my dress, asking about my background, seeming genuinely interested in becoming my friend. I had been so starved for female companionship, Kazuki's possessiveness had gradually isolated me from my old friends, that I had welcomed her with open arms. I had introduced her to my husband with such innocent pride, so pleased to have made what I thought was a genuine connection. I had watched them shake hands, had seen the spark of immediate attraction between them, and had felt nothing but mild amusement at how charming my new friend was. I had actually encouraged their friendship, happy that Kazuki finally seemed to have found someone whose company he genuinely enjoyed. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. This time, when Yuki approached me with that same bright smile and calculated warmth, I was ready for her. "You must be Kazuki's wife," she said, her voice musical and sweet. "I'm Yuki Tanaka. I work in public relations for Sakura Corporation. You look absolutely stunning tonight." "Thank you," I replied, keeping my own smile polite but distant. "I'm afraid I don't recognize your name. Have we met before?" I knew we hadn't, but I wanted to see how she would handle being questioned instead of immediately welcomed. In my previous life, I had been so eager to like her that I had never bothered to probe beneath her surface charm. "Oh, I don't believe we have," she said, and I caught the briefest flicker of surprise in her eyes. She had expected me to be as easy a mark as I had been before. "But I've heard so much about you. Your husband speaks of you often. Another lie. Kazuki barely mentioned me to anyone, least of all to attractive women at social events. But in my previous life, those words would have made my heart soar. I would have pressed her for details, desperate to hear anything positive about how my husband talked about me when I wasn't around. Does he? I said simply, not taking the bait. How interesting. Yuki's smile faltered slightly, and I could see her recalibrating her approach. She was used to women who were insecure, desperate for validation, easy to manipulate with a few well-placed compliments and fake confidences. My indifference was throwing off her game plan. I was hoping to meet him tonight, actually, she continued, her voice still sweet but with a slightly sharper edge. I have some business proposals that might interest his company. There it was. The opening move in what would become a 7-year campaign to destroy my life. In my previous life, I had immediately offered to introduce them, so eager to help my new friend and so oblivious to the danger she represented. I'm sure you'll find an opportunity to approach him yourself, I said instead. If you'll excuse me, I see someone I need to speak with. I walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing there with her perfect smile frozen in place. I could feel her watching me as I moved across the room, and I knew she was reassessing me, trying to figure out why her usual tactics weren't working. The rest of the evening passed in a strange dance of memory and revision. I watched Kazuki work the room with his practiced charm, noting how his attention lingered on other women, how his smile became genuine only when he was talking to anyone except me. I saw him notice Yuki, saw the immediate interest in his eyes, and felt nothing but a cold satisfaction that I was no longer blind to his true nature. When she finally maneuvered herself into position to meet him, approaching through a mutual business acquaintance since I had refused to facilitate the introduction, I watched their first conversation with the clarity of hindsight. I could see how she flattered his ego, how she made herself seem impressed by his intelligence and success, how she created an immediate sense of intimacy with carefully chosen words and meaningful glances. In my previous life, I had noticed their chemistry and felt only mild concern, quickly dismissed by my desperate need to believe in my husband's faithfulness. I had told myself that it was natural for him to enjoy talking to someone new, that it meant nothing, that I was being paranoid and insecure. This time, I watched them with the knowledge of where this conversation would lead, and I felt a cold rage building in my chest. Not jealousy, I was long past that, but fury at the elaborate cruelty they would inflict on me, the years of gaslighting and manipulation they would put me through, the way they would make me complicit in my own destruction. You're very quiet tonight, Kazuki said during the drive home. His voice carried a note of genuine puzzlement that would have been flattering in other circumstances. He was used to me hanging on his every word, analyzing his moods, desperately trying to please him. My silence was apparently more unsettling than he cared to admit. I was thinking, I replied, watching the city lights streak past the window. About what? I turned to look at him, studying his profile in the dim light of the car. He was still handsome, still carried himself with that confident elegance that had first attracted me. But now I could see the coldness beneath the surface, the way he held himself apart from genuine emotion, the calculating nature of everything he did. About choices, I said. About the paths we take and the consequences they lead to. He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him trying to parse the meaning behind my words. In our previous life together, I had been transparent to the point of naivety, wearing my emotions and thoughts on my face for him to read and dismiss. This new inscrutability was foreign territory for him. That's rather philosophical for a charity gala, he said finally, attempting his usual dismissive tone. But there was something underneath it, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Perhaps I'm feeling philosophical, I replied. Sometimes it takes a certain kind of clarity to see things as they really are. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. I could feel him wanting to probe deeper, to understand what had changed in me, but also sensing that he might not like the answers he would find. When we arrived home, I went directly to my room without the usual ritual of asking about his day, seeking his approval for how the evening had gone, or trying to extend our time together. In my previous life, I had lingered in the hallway, desperate for any sign of affection, any indication that he had enjoyed my company. This time, I simply said goodnight and closed my door, leaving him standing in the hallway with that same puzzled expression I was beginning to enjoy seeing on his face. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the butterfly effect. In my previous life, that evening had been the beginning of the end, though I hadn't known it at the time. Yuki would call the next day to invite me to lunch, beginning the friendship that would ultimately destroy me. She would slowly but systematically insert herself into every aspect of my life, gathering information about my insecurities, my fears, my weaknesses, and then weaponizing them against me. But this time, I had denied her that opening move. I had refused to be charmed, refused to make myself available for manipulation, refused to hand over the keys to my own destruction. The question now was what she would do next, how she would adapt her strategy, and whether I was strong enough to outmaneuver someone who had already proven capable of orchestrating my murder. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because I woke to sunlight streaming through my windows and the sound of my phone ringing. For a moment, I was disoriented, half expecting to wake up back in that warehouse with a knife in my chest. But I was still here, still 23, still armed with the knowledge of everything that was supposed to come next. The caller was Yuki, exactly as I had expected. In my previous life, I had been delighted to hear from her so soon, interpreting her quick follow-up as a sign of genuine friendship. I had agreed immediately to her lunch invitation, eager to continue what I thought was a promising new relationship. This time, I let the call go to voicemail and listened to her message with detached interest. Her voice was warm and friendly, just tinged with enough uncertainty to make it seem like she was taking a social risk by reaching out. She mentioned how much she had enjoyed our brief conversation, how she hoped we could get to know each other better, how she would love to take me to lunch at this charming little place she knew. It was perfectly crafted, designed to appeal to a lonely woman who was starved for female friendship. And it would have worked, just as it had before, if I hadn't known exactly what she was doing. I deleted the message without calling her back and got dressed for the day. I had my own plans to make, my own strategy to develop. If Yuki thought she could play the same game with the same rules, she was about to discover how wrong she was. Instead of staying home and waiting for her to make another move, I decided to go out. In my previous life, I had gradually isolated myself, partly due to Kazuki's subtle discouragement of my friendships and partly due to my own growing obsession with trying to be the perfect wife. I had lost touch with most of my college friends, had stopped pursuing the hobbies I enjoyed, had essentially erased my own identity in favor of becoming Mrs. Kazuki Nakamura. This time, I called my old friend May, someone I had pushed away in my previous life because Kazuki had made disparaging comments about her influence on me. In reality, May had been one of the few people who had tried to warn me about my husband's true nature, observations I had dismissed as jealousy or misunderstanding. "I can't believe you're calling," May said when she answered, and I could hear the genuine surprise and pleasure in her voice. "I thought you'd forgotten all about us mere mortals now that you're married to Mr. Perfect." Her words stung because they were true. I had abandoned my friends in favor of a man who barely tolerated my existence, and they had every right to be resentful. "I've been doing some thinking," I told her. "About priorities, about the people who really matter. Are you free for lunch today?" We met at a small cafe in the Arts District, the kind of place I used to love before I started dining only at the upscale restaurants that Kazuki preferred. May looked exactly as I remembered her, short and energetic, with paint-stained fingers and expressive eyes that missed nothing. She had been an art major in college, and I could see from her portfolio bag that she was still pursuing her passion. "You look different," she said, studying my face as we sat down. "Older somehow, but not in a bad way. More settled, maybe? Like you've figured something out." If only she knew how true that was. "I've been reevaluating some things," I said carefully. "My marriage, my choices, the way I've been living." May's expression grew serious. Are you okay? Is everything all right with Kazuki? The concern in her voice made me realize how much I had missed having real friends, people who cared about my well-being rather than what I could do for them. In my previous life, I had been so focused on winning my husband's love that I had taken for granted the love that was already freely offered by people like May. That's complicated, I admitted. But I'm starting to see some things more clearly than I did before. We talked for hours, and it felt like coming back to life. May told me about her art, her struggles and successes, her complicated relationship with a fellow artist who couldn't decide if he wanted to commit. I found myself laughing for the first time in what felt like years, remembering what it was like to have conversations that weren't carefully calculated to avoid my husband's disapproval. I missed this, I told her as we were finishing our coffee. I missed you. I'm sorry for disappearing the way I did. You don't have to apologize, May said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Marriage changes things, I understand that. But I'm glad you called. I've been worried about you. Worried how? She hesitated, clearly debating whether to say something that might offend me. You seemed to lose yourself after the wedding. Like you were trying so hard to be perfect that you forgot who you really were. And Kazuki. She paused again. What about Kazuki? I never liked how he looked at you, she said finally. Like you were a possession rather than a person. Like he was calculating your value instead of appreciating your worth. Her words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel but because they were so accurate. May had seen in a few interactions what I had failed to recognize in 7 years of marriage. You tried to tell me, didn't you? I said. Before the wedding, after the wedding. You tried to warn me. I tried to ask questions, she corrected. I wanted you to think about whether you were truly happy or just trying to convince yourself you should be. I thought about that conversation as I walked home, about all the warnings I had ignored, all the red flags I had dismissed as other people's jealousy or inability to understand my relationship. May had seen what everyone else had seen, that I was trapped in a marriage with a man who didn't love me, slowly disappearing into a role that was killing my spirit piece by piece. But this time would be different. This time, I would listen to the people who actually cared about me. This time, I would remember who I was before I became obsessed with earning love from someone incapable of giving it. My phone buzzed as I was walking up the steps to our house. Yuki again. This time she had sent a text message, expressing concern that she hadn't heard back from me and hoping that she hadn't somehow offended me at the gala. The message struck just the right note of worried friendliness, designed to make me feel guilty for not responding and eager to reassure her that everything was fine. I deleted the message without responding and went inside. Kazuki was home early, which was unusual. In my previous life, he had worked late most nights, claiming that building his career required sacrifice and dedication. I had believed him, had even admired his work ethic, never questioning why his sacrifices always seemed to involve spending less time with his wife. Now I understood that his late nights had probably been spent with other women, establishing the pattern of infidelity that would eventually lead to his relationship with Yuki. You're home, he said when I walked into the living room, and there was something in his voice that I couldn't quite identify. Surprise? Suspicion? Where were you today? In my previous life, I would have eagerly told him about my lunch with May, seeking his approval and hoping he would be pleased that I was reconnecting with old friends. His disapproval would have crushed me, and I would have gradually stopped seeing her to avoid his subtle but persistent criticism. I had lunch with an old friend, I said simply, not elaborating. Which friend? Mei Tanaka. We went to college together. I watched his expression carefully and saw the familiar flicker of displeasure that I had once tried so hard to avoid. In my previous life, I had told myself that his reaction was protective, that he just wanted what was best for me. Now I could see it for what it really was, control. I thought you had grown apart from her, he said, his tone carefully neutral. People change, I replied. Sometimes they grow back together. That evening was strange and tense in a way that our evenings had never been before. Usually, I spent dinner asking about his day, listening to his work stories, trying to engage him in conversation about anything that might capture his interest. I would clear the table, do the dishes, and then settle next to him on the couch while he watched television or worked on his laptop, content just to be in his presence even if he barely acknowledged mine. This time, I ate my dinner in comfortable silence, cleaned up efficiently without trying to draw him into conversation, and then retired to the home office to work on some freelance graphic design projects I had abandoned after our marriage. In my previous life, Kazuki had gradually discouraged my career, suggesting that his income was sufficient and that my time would be better spent supporting his ambitions rather than pursuing my own. I could feel him watching me as I worked, could sense his confusion at my sudden independence. When I finally went to bed, he was still sitting in the living room, staring at his laptop screen but not really working, clearly trying to process the changes in my behavior. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Yuki continued to call and text, her messages growing slightly more persistent as I failed to respond. I could imagine her frustration, the way she must be trying to figure out why her usual approach wasn't working. In my previous life, she would have already secured our first lunch date by now, already begun the process of inserting herself into my daily routine. Meanwhile, Kazuki seemed increasingly unsettled by my transformation. He had grown accustomed to a wife who orbited around him like a satellite, whose mood depended entirely on his attention or lack thereof, who existed primarily as an extension of his own image and aspirations. My sudden self-sufficiency was clearly disturbing his equilibrium. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked one morning over breakfast, his tone carrying that note of husbandly concern that I had once found so touching. "I feel better than I have in years," I told him, and it was the truth. For the first time since our wedding, I felt like myself again, strong, independent, capable of happiness that didn't depend on his approval. "You seem different lately." Distant. I looked up from my coffee to study his face. In my previous life, any sign of his concern for our relationship would have sent me into a panic of reassurance, desperate to convince him that everything was fine, that I was still the devoted wife he expected me to be. "Different how?" I asked calmly. "I don't know. Less." He struggled for words, clearly trying to articulate something he had never had to think about before. "Less attentive, I suppose. Less interested in us." The irony was breathtaking. For 7 years, he had been completely indifferent to my feelings, my needs, my very existence, and I had convinced myself that this was normal, that this was love. But now that I had stopped performing devotion, stopped begging for crumbs of his attention, he was suddenly concerned about the state of our relationship. "Perhaps I'm just less desperate," I said, returning to my coffee. "Desperate for what?" I looked at him again, and this time I let him see the full weight of my knowledge in my eyes. "For you to love me the way I loved you." The silence that followed was deafening. Kazuki stared at me as if I had just spoken in a foreign language, his expression cycling through confusion, discomfort, and something that might have been guilt. "I don't understand what you mean," he said finally. "I think you do," I replied. "I think you've always understood exactly how much I loved you and exactly how little you loved me back. The only difference is that I'm not pretending anymore." I finished my coffee and stood to leave, but his voice stopped me at the kitchen door. "Where is this coming from?" he asked, and for the first time since I had known him, Kazuki sounded genuinely shaken. "Has someone been talking to you? Putting ideas in your head?" I turned back to look at him, this man I had wasted so many years loving, and felt nothing but a deep, profound pity. "No one had to put ideas in my head," I said. "I just finally stopped ignoring the ones that were already there." That afternoon, Yuki finally gave up on subtle approaches and called while I was working in my office. When I saw her name on the caller ID, I knew that this would be her attempt to regain control of the situation, to figure out why her usual manipulation tactics weren't working. I answered on the fourth ring. Yuki, I said, my voice pleasant but not warm. Oh, thank goodness you answered, she said, her relief sounding genuine. I was starting to worry that I had somehow offended you the other night. I've been trying to reach you for days. I've been busy, I said simply. Of course, I understand completely. I really felt like we connected at the gala, and I was hoping we could get to know each other better. I don't have many female friends in the city, and you seemed so lovely. It was perfectly done, the right amount of vulnerability, the subtle flattery, the suggestion that I would be doing her a favor by accepting her friendship. In my previous life, those words would have melted my defenses completely. That's kind of you to say, I replied, giving her nothing to work with. I was wondering if you might be free for lunch this week. There's this wonderful little French place I discovered, very intimate and quiet. Perfect for really getting to know someone. I could picture her as she spoke, probably sitting in her perfectly appointed apartment, calculating every word for maximum effect. She needed that lunch, needed to begin the process of learning my weaknesses and insecurities, needed to establish the foundation of trust that would allow her to destroy me from within. I'm afraid my schedule is quite full this week, I said. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her recalibrating. Of course, I understand. Perhaps next week? Or even just coffee sometime? I really would love the chance to talk more. I'll check my calendar and get back to you, I said, knowing that I never would. Wonderful. I'll look forward to hearing from you. After I hung up, I sat in my office thinking about the conversation, about the subtle desperation I had heard beneath her polished exterior. Yuki was used to getting what she wanted, used to people being charmed by her beauty and apparent sincerity. My continued resistance was clearly throwing her off her game. But I knew she wouldn't give up easily. In my previous life, she had proven herself to be remarkably persistent and creative when it came to achieving her goals. If the direct approach wasn't working, she would find another way to insert herself into my life. I didn't have to wait long to find out what that way would be. The next evening, Kazuki came home with news that made my blood run cold, even though I should have expected it. I've hired a new consultant for the Morrison project, he announced over dinner, his tone casual but his eyes watching my reaction carefully. Someone with excellent credentials in public relations. Yuki Tanaka, I believe you met her at the gala. There it was. Her backup plan. If she couldn't approach me as a friend, she would insert herself into my life through my husband's business. In my previous life, this had been the beginning of their professional relationship, which had quickly evolved into something more personal. How convenient, I said, cutting my steak with deliberate precision. I'm sure she'll be very dedicated to the project. Something flickered in Kazuki's eyes, surprise at my lack of enthusiasm, perhaps, or confusion at my knowing tone. In my previous life, I had been pleased by this development, seeing it as confirmation that my new friend was as successful and capable as she had seemed. She came highly recommended, he said, still watching me. And she specifically mentioned meeting you, said she hoped to work with someone whose wife had made such a positive impression. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Yuki had used my own reputation to secure access to my husband, had probably convinced him that hiring her would please me. It was exactly the kind of calculated move that had made her so dangerous in my previous life. I'm sure you'll work very well together, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. You seem to have similar approaches to business. The weeks that followed were like watching a car crash in slow motion, except this time I wasn't trapped inside the wreckage. I observed from a safe distance as Yuki began her campaign to seduce my husband, noting every carefully orchestrated encounter, every seemingly innocent reason she had to stay late at the office, every meaningful glance and casual touch. In my previous life, I had noticed these things too, but I had explained them away, convinced myself that I was being paranoid, that my insecurity was making me see threats where none existed. I had actually felt guilty for suspecting them, had berated myself for not trusting my husband's faithfulness. This time, I watched their dance of attraction with cold detachment, even a certain professional admiration for Yuki's skill. She was incredibly good at what she did, making herself indispensable professionally while slowly breaking down Kazuki's emotional barriers, creating situations that seemed coincidental but were clearly orchestrated, positioning herself as everything I was not. Where I had become quiet and withdrawn, she was vivacious and engaging. Where I had grown comfortable and perhaps complacent in my appearance, she was always immaculately groomed and effortlessly elegant. Where I had stopped challenging Kazuki intellectually, content to simply support his ambitions, she debated with him, disagreed with him, made him work for her approval. She was everything I had once been before marriage had slowly eroded my confidence and independence, and everything I had stopped being in my desperate attempts to be the perfect wife. But this time, instead of competing with her, I simply stepped back and let them have each other. I started taking evening classes in web design, something I had always wanted to pursue but had abandoned when Kazuki expressed doubt about the viability of the field. I reconnected with more old friends, built a social life that existed independently of my husband's approval. I began freelancing again, taking on projects that excited me rather than just ones that paid well. For the first time in years, I was happy. Genuinely, authentically happy, in a way that had nothing to do with my marriage or my husband's attention. Kazuki noticed, of course. How could he not, when the wife who had once hung on his every word was now coming home energized from her own activities, talking about her own successes, existing as a complete person rather than half of a couple? "You seem to be enjoying your classes," he said one evening, his tone carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with something I couldn't quite identify. "I am," I replied, not elaborating. In my previous life, I would have launched into an enthusiastic description of everything I was learning, desperate to share my excitement with him and hoping he would be proud of my accomplishments. "And your freelance work is going well?" "Very well, actually. I'm thinking about expanding, maybe starting my own firm." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. Kazuki had always preferred me dependent, had subtly discouraged any signs of independence or ambition that might take my focus away from supporting his career. "That's quite ambitious," he said finally. "Is it?" I looked up from my laptop where I had been working on a client proposal. "Or is it just normal for someone to want to build something of their own?" He didn't answer, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. This wasn't the wife he had married, wasn't the woman he could control and dismiss. And he didn't know what to do with that. Meanwhile, his relationship with Yuki was progressing exactly as it had in my previous life, except faster. Without me clinging desperately to him, demanding his attention and time, he had more freedom to pursue what he really wanted. And what he really wanted, apparently, was a woman who would challenge him, excite him, make him feel like the conquering hero rather than the bored husband. I found evidence of their affair exactly where I had found it before: credit card statements showing expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together, hotel charges on nights when he claimed to be working late, receipts for jewelry I never received. In my previous life, discovering these things had nearly destroyed me. I had confronted him with tears and accusations, had begged him to explain, had convinced myself that there must be some innocent explanation. This time, I simply documented everything and waited. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not at all what either of them expected. It was a rainy Thursday evening in November when Kazuki finally worked up the courage to ask for a divorce. He had taken me to dinner at an expensive restaurant, probably at Yuki's suggestion, and spent most of the meal looking uncomfortable and rehearsing his words. "I think we need to talk," he said as we finished our dessert, his voice carrying that tone of false gentleness that I remembered so well. "About what?" I asked, though of course I knew. "About us. About our marriage." He paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase what came next. "I think we both know that we've grown apart over the years. We want different things, we've become different people. In my previous life, this conversation had been a devastating ambush. I had been completely blindsided, had begged him to reconsider, had promised to change whatever he wanted me to change if only he would give our marriage another chance. This time, I simply nodded and said, I agree. The relief on his face was so obvious it was almost comical. He had clearly been prepared for tears, for pleading, for the kind of desperate emotional scene I had provided the first time. I think it would be best for both of us if we pursued a divorce, he continued, gaining confidence from my calm reaction. We can keep it amicable, divide things fairly. You'll be well taken care of course. Of course, I agreed. I assume you have someone in mind to replace me? The question caught him off guard, and for a moment his composure slipped. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. I took a sip of my wine and watched him squirm. Yuki Tanaka is lovely, by the way. I'm sure you'll be very happy together. The color drained from his face. In my previous life, I had suspected but never directly accused. He had been able to maintain the fiction that this was simply about our incompatibility, not about his infidelity. How long have you known? He asked quietly. Does it matter? I replied. The question is what you want to do now. I never meant for it to happen this way, he said, and for the first time since I had known him, Kazuki sounded genuinely remorseful. I never wanted to hurt you. I looked at this man who had been the center of my world for so many years, who had consumed my thoughts and shaped my choices and ultimately orchestrated my death, and felt nothing but a profound emptiness where love used to live. The funny thing is, I said, I don't think you're capable of really hurting me anymore. You can only hurt someone who still cares about your opinion of them. The divorce proceedings were swift and surprisingly painless. Kazuki, perhaps motivated by guilt or simply eager to start his new life with Yuki, was more generous than I had expected. I kept the house, received a substantial settlement, and retained my rights to the business we had technically started together, though I had done most of the work while he provided the funding. But most importantly, I was free. The day our divorce was finalized, I stood in the courthouse lobby and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, hope. Not hope that someone else would love me, not hope that I could win back what I had lost, but hope for what I might build with my own hands and my own choices. Yuki, of course, wasted no time in moving into what had once been our home. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had redecorated completely, erasing all traces of my existence with the efficiency of someone who had been planning the renovation for years. They seemed happy together, at least at first. Yuki had gotten what she wanted, a wealthy husband with good social connections and no inconvenient ex-wife to complicate matters. Kazuki had gotten what he thought he wanted, a beautiful, exciting woman who made him feel desired and important. But I knew things about both of them that they didn't know about each other. I knew that Yuki's interest in Kazuki was primarily financial and social, that she had targeted him specifically because of his wealth and position, not because of any genuine emotional connection. I knew that Kazuki was incapable of the kind of deep, lasting love that sustains a marriage through difficult times, that his attraction to Yuki was based on novelty and ego rather than real compatibility. And I knew that both of them were the kind of people who would betray anyone if it served their interests, because they had already proven that by betraying me. So I waited, and I watched, and I built my own life while theirs slowly began to unravel. My business grew faster than I had ever imagined possible. Without Kazuki's subtle discouragement and constant demands on my time and energy, I was able to focus completely on my work. I discovered that I had a talent for understanding what clients really needed, not just what they said they wanted, and my reputation spread through word of mouth. Within a year, I had moved into a beautiful office space downtown and hired 3 employees. Within 2 years, I was turning down more projects than I accepted, able to choose only the work that challenged and excited me. I also discovered that I was attractive to other men in ways I had forgotten during my marriage. Not desperate to be loved, not willing to accept scraps of attention, I had apparently developed an appeal that I had never possessed when I was frantically trying to make myself worthy of Kazuki's affection. But I wasn't interested in another relationship, not yet. I was too busy falling in love with my own life, with the person I was becoming when I wasn't defined by someone else's opinion of my worth. Meanwhile, cracks were beginning to show in the perfect facade of Kazuki and Yuki's relationship. It started with small things, missed social events, tension at public appearances, rumors of arguments that were becoming too loud to hide from the household staff. Then came the more serious problems. Kazuki's business began to suffer as he spent more time managing Yuki's increasingly expensive tastes and unpredictable moods. She had apparently assumed that marriage would give her unlimited access to his wealth, but Kazuki, despite his flaws, had always been careful with money. Their fights about spending became legendary among their social circle. More damaging was Yuki's inability to maintain the facade of devotion once she had achieved her primary goal. The challenge of winning Kazuki had kept her interested, but marriage had made him predictable, and Yuki was someone who needed constant stimulation and validation. I heard through May, who had remained plugged into the social gossip network, that Yuki had been seen with other men at events where Kazuki was absent. Nothing confirmed, but enough sightings to start rumors, enough rumors to damage both their reputations. The irony was perfect. Yuki was doing to Kazuki exactly what he had done to me, and he was experiencing for the first time the pain of loving someone who didn't love him back. But the real vindication came 3 years after our divorce, when I received an unexpected phone call. "I need to see you," Kazuki said, his voice strained in a way I had never heard before. "Please. It's important." We met at the same cafe where I had reconnected with May, and I barely recognized the man who walked in. Kazuki looked older, worn down, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. "Thank you for coming," he said as he sat down across from me. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I replied honestly. "What did you want to talk about?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as if trying to figure out how to begin. "I made a mistake," he said finally. "The biggest mistake of my life." "Which mistake would that be?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. "Leaving you. Choosing her over what we had." He looked up at me then, and I was shocked to see tears in his eyes. I threw away the best thing in my life for someone who never really loved me. In my previous life, these words would have been everything I had ever wanted to hear. I would have forgiven him instantly, would have been pathetically grateful for any sign that he finally understood my value. This time, I felt nothing but a distant sort of pity. "What happened?" I asked. "She's been having an affair," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Multiple affairs, apparently. With men who have more money than I do, more status, more to offer her. I found out last week that she's been planning to leave me for months, just waiting for the right opportunity." I thought about the warehouse, about the knife in my chest, about watching my husband do nothing while his mistress murdered me. I thought about 7 years of emotional manipulation and gaslighting, about slowly losing myself in pursuit of love from someone incapable of giving it. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Not because I wanted him back, but because I genuinely felt sorry for anyone who was experiencing the pain I had once endured. "I know I have no right to ask this," he continued, "but I was hoping. I was wondering if there might be any chance for us. If we could try again, start over, do it right this time." The silence stretched between us as I considered my answer. In my previous life, this moment would have been the ultimate fantasy, my husband realizing his mistake, begging for my forgiveness, acknowledging my worth at last. But sitting there looking at him, I realized that his recognition of my value meant nothing to me anymore. I had spent so many years desperately seeking his approval that I had forgotten the most important truth: the only opinion of my worth that really mattered was my own. "No," I said simply. "Please," he said, leaning forward with an urgency that would once have melted my resistance. "I know I hurt you, I know I was wrong, but I've learned from my mistakes. I can be the husband you deserved, the husband I should have been from the beginning." "I don't doubt that you could," I replied. But the person you want to be that husband to doesn't exist anymore. The woman who loved you, who needed your approval, who would have done anything to make you happy, she died in that marriage. I'm someone else now. But we could build something new together, he persisted. We know each other, we have history, we could make it work this time. I looked at this man who had once been my entire world, who had shaped my choices and consumed my thoughts for so many years, and felt a profound sense of closure. The problem isn't that you didn't love me well enough, I told him. The problem is that I loved you too much. I lost myself trying to become what you wanted, and it took losing you to find myself again. I won't make that mistake twice. He stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, clearly struggling to understand how I could reject what he saw as a generous offer of redemption. I could make you happy, he said desperately. I know I could, if you just gave me another chance. I'm already happy, I said, standing to leave. That's what you never understood, Kazuki. Happiness isn't something someone else can give you or take away from you. It's something you create for yourself. I left him sitting there in that cafe, looking lost and broken, and I felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. Not gratitude for the pain I had endured, but gratitude for the strength I had discovered, for the life I had built with my own hands, for the woman I had become when I stopped trying to be what someone else wanted. 6 months later, I heard that Yuki had indeed left him, taking a substantial portion of his assets in their divorce settlement. She had moved to Tokyo with a businessman who could offer her the lifestyle she had always believed she deserved. Kazuki had tried to contest the settlement, but Yuki had been as ruthless in ending their marriage as she had been in pursuing it. She had documented his infidelity during our marriage, had gathered evidence of his business dealings that he preferred to keep private, had essentially turned his own tactics against him with devastating efficiency. He lost his house, his business suffered irreparable damage to its reputation, and he was forced to start over in a way that I don't think he had ever imagined possible. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, no sense of justice served. His suffering didn't undo mine, didn't erase the years I had wasted or give me back the time I had lost. But it did confirm something I had suspected all along, that people like Kazuki and Yuki, people who build their lives on the manipulation and betrayal of others, ultimately destroy themselves. Their inability to form genuine connections, their constant need to take rather than give, their fundamental selfishness, it all catches up with them eventually. As for me, I continued to build the life I had chosen rather than the one that had been imposed on me. My business thrived, my friendships deepened, and I discovered interests and talents I had never had the freedom to explore during my marriage. I traveled to places I had always wanted to see but had never visited because Kazuki preferred familiar destinations. I took cooking classes and learned to paint and started hiking on weekends with a group of women who became some of my closest friends. And eventually, when I was ready, I did fall in love again, but this time with someone who loved me back fully and completely, someone who celebrated my independence rather than trying to diminish it, someone who understood that a healthy relationship is about two complete people choosing to share their lives rather than two incomplete people trying to become whole through each other.